Chapter 13. For a period of 4 months at least this was exactly the way it worked out. After meeting her in this fashion, he was devoting not an inconsiderable portion of his free time to attempting to interest her to the point where she would take as much interest in him as she appeared to take in others. At the same time he could not tell whether she could be made to entertain a singular affection for anyone. Nor could he believe that there was only an innocent camaraderie involved in all this. Yet she was so enticing that he was deliriously moved by the thought that if his worst suspicions were true, she might ultimately favor him. So captivated was he by this savor of sensuality and varietism that was about her, the stigmata of desire manifest in her gestures, moods, voice, the way she dressed, that he could not think of relinquishing her. Rather, he foolishly ran after her. And seeing this, she put him off, at times evaded him, compelled him to content himself with little more than the crumbs of her company, while at the same time favoring him with descriptions or pictures of other activities and contacts which made him feel as though he could no longer endure to merely trail her in this fashion. It was then he would announce to himself in anger that he was not going to see her any more. She was no good to him, really. But on seeing her again, a cold indifference in everything she said and did, his courage failed him and he could not think of severing the tie. She was not at all backward at the same time in speaking of things that she needed or would like to have, little things, at first, a new powder puff, a lipstick, a box of powder or a bottle of perfume. Later, and without having yielded anything more to Clyde than a few elusive and evasive endearments, intimate and languorous reclinings in his arms which promised much but always came to nothing, she made so bold as to indicate to him at different times and in different ways, purses, blouses, slippers, stockings, a hat, which she would like to buy if only she had the money. And he, in order to hold her favor and properly ingratiate himself, proceeded to buy them, though at times and because of some other developments in connection with his family, it pressed him hard to do so. And yet, as he was beginning to see toward the end of the 4th month, he was apparently little farther advanced in her favor than he had been in the beginning. In short, he was conducting a feverish and almost painful pursuit without any definite promise of reward. In the meantime, in so far as his home ties went, the irritations and the depressions which were almost inextricably involved with membership in the Griffiths family were not different from what they had ever been. For, following the disappearance of Esta, there had settled a period of dejection which still endured. Only, in so far as Clyde was concerned, it was complicated with a mystery which was tantalizing and something more, irritating, for when it came to anything which related to sex in the Griffiths family, no parents could possibly have been more squeamish. And especially did this apply to the mystery which had now surrounded Esta for some time. She had gone. She had not returned. And so far as Clyde and the others knew, no word of any kind had been received from her. However, Clyde had noted that after the first few weeks of her absence, during which time both his mother and father had been most intensely wrought up and troubled, worrying greatly as to her whereabouts and why she did not write, suddenly they had ceased their worries, and had become very much more resigned, at least not so tortured by a situation that previously had seemed to offer no hope whatsoever. He could not explain it. It was quite noticeable, and yet nothing was said. And then one day a little later, Clyde had occasion to note that his mother was in communication with someone by mail, something rare for her. For so few were her social or business connections that she rarely received or wrote a letter. One day, however, very shortly after he had connected himself with the Green Davidson, he had come in rather earlier than usual in the afternoon and found his mother bending over a letter which evidently had just arrived and which appeared to interest her greatly. Also it seemed to be connected with something which required concealment. For, on seeing him, she stopped reading at once, and, flustered and apparently nervous, rose and put the letter away without commenting in any way upon what she had been doing. But Clyde, for some reason, intuition perhaps, had the thought that it might be from Esta. He was not sure. And he was too far away to detect the character of the handwriting. But whatever it was, his mother said nothing afterwards concerning it. She looked as though she did not want him to inquire, and so reserved were their relations that he would not have thought of inquiring. He merely wondered, and then dismissed it partially, but not entirely, from his mind. A month or 5 weeks after this, and just about the time that he was becoming comparatively well schooled in his work at the Green Davidson, and was beginning to interest himself in Hortense Briggs, his mother came to him one afternoon with a very peculiar proposition for her. Without explaining what it was for, or indicating directly that now she felt that he might be in a better position to help her, she called him into the mission hall when he came in from work and, looking at him rather fixedly and nervously for her, said, "You wouldn't know, Clyde, would you, how I could raise $100 right away?" Clyde was so astonished that he could scarcely believe his ears, for only a few weeks before the mere mention of any sum above $4 or $5 in connection with him would have been preposterous. His mother knew that. Yet here she was asking him and apparently assuming that he might be able to assist her in this way. And rightly, for both his clothes and his general air had indicated a period of better days for him. At the same time his first thought was, of course, that she had observed his clothes and goings-on and was convinced that he was deceiving her about the amount he earned. And in part this was true, only so changed was Clyde's manner of late, that his mother had been compelled to take a very different attitude toward him and was beginning to be not a little dubious as to her further control over him. Recently, or since he had secured this latest place, for some reason he had seemed to her to have grown wiser, more assured, less dubious of himself, inclined to go his own way and keep his own counsel. And while this had troubled her not a little in one sense, it rather pleased her in another. For to see Clyde, who had always seemed because of his sensitiveness and unrest so much of a problem to her, developing in this very interesting way was something, though at times, and in view of his very recent finery, she had been wondering and troubled as to the nature of the company he might be keeping. But since his hours were so long and so absorbing, and whatever money he made appeared to be going into clothes, she felt that she had no real reason to complain. Her one other thought was that perhaps he was beginning to act a little selfish, to think too much of his own comfort, and yet in the face of his long deprivations she could not very well begrudge him any temporary pleasure, either. Clyde, not being sure of her real attitude, merely looked at her and exclaimed, "Why, where would I get $100, Ma?" He had visions of his newfound source of wealth being dissipated by such unheard of and inexplicable demands as this, and distress and distrust at once showed on his countenance. "I didn't expect that you could get it all for me," Mrs. Griffiths suggested tactfully. "I have a plan to raise the most of it, I think. But I did want you to help me try to think how I would raise the rest. I didn't want to go to your father with this if I could help it, and you're getting old enough now to be of some help." She looked at Clyde approvingly and interestedly enough. "Your father is such a poor hand at business," she went on, "and he gets so worried at times." She passed a large and weary hand over her face and Clyde was moved by her predicament, whatever it was. At the same time, apart from whether he was willing to part with so much or not, or had it to give, he was decidedly curious about what all this was for. $100. Gee whiz. After a moment or two, his mother added, "I'll tell you what I've been thinking. I must have $100, but I can't tell you for what now, you nor anyone, and you mustn't ask me. There's an old gold watch of your father's in my desk and a solid gold ring and pin of mine. Those things ought to be worth $25 at least, if they were sold or pawned. Then there is that set of solid silver knives and forks and that silver platter and pitcher in there." Clyde knew the keepsakes well. "That platter alone is worth $25. I believe they ought to bring at least 20 or 25 together. I was thinking if I could get you to go to some good pawnshop with them down near where you work, and then if you would let me have 5 more a week for a while." Clyde's countenance fell. "I could get a friend of mine, Mr. Merck, who comes here, you know, to advance me enough to make up the 100, and then I could pay him back out of what you pay me. I have about $10 myself." She looked at Clyde as much as to say, "Now, surely, you won't desert me in my hour of trouble, and Clyde relaxed, in spite of the fact that he had been counting upon using quite all that he earned for himself. In fact, he agreed to take the trinkets to the pawnshop, and to advance her 5 more for the time being until the difference between whatever the trinkets brought and $100 was made up. And yet, in spite of himself, he could not help resenting this extra strain, for it had only been a very short time that he had been earning so much. And here was his mother demanding more and more, as he saw it, $10 a week now. Always something wrong, thought Clyde, always something needed, and with no assurance that there would not be more such demands later. He took the trinkets, carried them to the most presentable pawnshop he could find, and being offered $45 for the lot, took it. This, with his mother's 10, would make 55, and with 45 she could borrow from Mr. Merk, would make 100. Only now, as he saw, it would mean that for 9 weeks he would have to give her $10 instead of 5. And that, in view of his present aspirations to dress, live and enjoy himself in a way entirely different from what he previously considered necessary, was by no means a pleasure to contemplate. Nevertheless, he decided to do it. After all, he owed his mother something. She had made many sacrifices for him and the others in days past, and he could not afford to be too selfish. It was not decent. But the most enduring thought that now came to him was that if his mother and father were going to look to him for financial aid, they should be willing to show him more consideration than had previously been shown him. For one thing, he ought to be allowed to come and go with more freedom, insofar as his night hours were concerned. And at the same time he was clothing himself and eating his meals at the hotel, and that was no small item, as he saw it. However, there was another problem that had soon arisen, and it was this. Not so long after the matter of the $100, he encountered his mother in Montrose Street, one of the poorest streets which ran north from Bickle, and which consisted entirely of 2 unbroken lines of wooden houses and 2-story flats and many unfurnished apartments. Even the Griffiths, poor as they were, would have felt themselves demeaned by the thought of having to dwell in such a street. His mother was coming down the front steps of one of the less tatterdemalion houses of this row, a lower front window of which carried a very conspicuous card which read "Furnished Rooms." And then, without turning or seeing Clyde across the street, she proceeded to another house a few doors away, which also carried a "Furnished Rooms" card and, after surveying the exterior interestedly, mounted the steps and rang the bell. Clyde's first impression was that she was seeking the whereabouts of some individual in whom she was interested and of whose address she was not certain. But crossing over to her at about the moment the proprietress of the house put her head out of the door, he heard his mother say, "You have a room for rent?" "Yes." "Has it a bath?" "No, but there's a bath on the 2nd floor." "How much is it a week?" $4. "Could I see it?" "Yes, just step in." Mrs. Griffiths appeared to hesitate while Clyde stood below, not 25 feet away, and looked up at her, waiting for her to turn and recognize him. But she stepped in without turning. And Clyde gazed after her curiously, for while it was by no means inconceivable that his mother might be looking for a room for someone, yet why should she be looking for it in this street when as a rule she usually dealt with the Salvation Army or the Young Women's Christian Association? His first impulse was to wait and inquire of her what she was doing here, but being interested in several errands of his own, he went on. That night, returning to his own home to dress and seeing his mother in the kitchen, he said to her, "I saw you this morning, Ma, in Montrose Street." "Yes," his mother replied, after a moment, but not before he had noticed that she had started suddenly as though taken aback by this information. She was paring potatoes and looked at him curiously. "Well, what of it?" she added, calmly, but flushing just the same, a thing decidedly unusual in connection with her where he was concerned. Indeed, that start of surprise interested and arrested Clyde. "You were going into a house there, looking for a furnished room, I guess." "Yes, I was," replied Mrs. Griffiths, simply enough now. "I need a room for someone who is sick and hasn't much money, but it's not so easy to find either." She turned away as though she were not disposed to discuss this anymore, and Clyde, while sensing her mood, apparently, could not resist adding, "Gee, that's not much of a street to have a room in." His new work at the Green Davidson had already caused him to think differently of how one should live, anyone. She did not answer him and he went to his room to change his clothes. A month or so after this, coming east on Missouri Avenue late one evening, he again saw his mother in the near distance coming west. In the light of one of the small stores which ranged in a row on this street, he saw that she was carrying a rather heavy old-fashioned bag, which had long been about the house but had never been much used by anyone. On sight of him approaching, as he afterwards decided, she had stopped suddenly and turned into a hallway of a 3-story brick apartment building, and when he came up to it, he found the outside door was shut. He opened it, and saw a flight of steps dimly lit, up which she might have gone. However, he did not trouble to investigate, for he was uncertain, once he reached this place, whether she had gone to call on someone or not. It had all happened so quickly. But waiting at the next corner, he finally saw her come out again. And then to his increasing curiosity, she appeared to look cautiously about before proceeding as before. It was this that caused him to think that she must have been endeavoring to conceal herself from him. But why? His first impulse was to turn and follow her, so interested was he by her strange movements. But he decided later that if she did not want him to know what she was doing, perhaps it was best that he should not. At the same time he was made intensely curious by this evasive gesture. Why should his mother not wish him to see her carrying a bag anywhere? Evasion and concealment formed no part of her real disposition, so different from his own. Almost instantly his mind proceeded to join this coincidence with the time he had seen her descending the steps of the rooming house in Montrose Street, together with the business of the letter he had found her reading, and the money she had been compelled to raise, the $100. Where could she be going? What was she hiding? He speculated on all this, but he could not decide whether it had any definite connection with him or any member of the family until about a week later, when, passing along 11th near Baltimore, he thought he saw Esta, or at least a girl so much like her that she would be taken for her anywhere. She had the same height, and she was moving along as Esta used to walk. Only, now he thought as he saw her, she looked older. Yet, so quickly had she come and gone in the mass of people that he had not been able to make sure. It was only a glance, but on the strength of it, he had turned and sought to catch up with her, but upon reaching the spot she was gone. So convinced was he, however, that he had seen her that he went straight home, and, encountering his mother in the Mission, announced that he was positive he had seen Esta. She must be back in Kansas City again. He could have sworn to it. He had seen her near 11th and Baltimore, or thought he had. Had his mother heard anything from her? And then curiously enough he observed that his mother's manner was not exactly what he thought it should have been under the circumstances. His own attitude had been one of commingled astonishment, pleasure, curiosity and sympathy because of the sudden disappearance and now sudden reappearance of Esta. Could it be that his mother had used that $100 to bring her back? The thought had come to him, why or from where, he could not say. He wondered. But if so, why had she not returned to her home, at least to notify the family of her presence here? He expected his mother would be as astonished and puzzled as he was quick and curious for details. Instead, she appeared to him to be obviously confused and taken aback by this information, as though she was hearing about something that she already knew and was puzzled as to just what her attitude should be. "Oh, did you? Where? Just now, you say? At 11th and Baltimore? Well, isn't that strange? I must speak to ASA about this. It's strange that she wouldn't come here if she is back." Her eyes, as he saw, instead of looking astonished, looked puzzled, disturbed. Her mouth, always the case when she was a little embarrassed and disconcerted, worked oddly, not only the lips but the jaw itself. Well, she added, after a pause. That is strange. Perhaps it was just someone who looked like her. But Clyde, watching her out of the corner of his eye, could not believe that she was as astonished as she pretended. And, thereafter, Asa coming in, and Clyde not having as yet departed for the hotel, he heard them discussing the matter in some strangely inattentive and unillumined way, as if it was not quite as startling as it had seemed to him. And for some time he was not called in to explain what he had seen. And then, as if purposely to solve this mystery for him, he encountered his mother one day passing along Spruce Street, this time carrying a small basket on her arm. She had, as he had noticed of late, taken to going out regularly mornings and afternoons or evenings. On this occasion, and long before she had had an opportunity to see him, he had discerned her peculiarly heavy figure draped in the old brown coat which she always wore, and had turned into Miracle Street and waited for her to pass, a convenient newsstand offering him shelter. Once she had passed, he dropped behind her, allowing her to precede him by half a block. And at Dalrymple, she crossed to Beaudry, which was really a continuation of Spruce, but not so ugly. The houses were quite old, quondam residences of an earlier day, but now turned into boarding and rooming houses. Into one of these he saw her enter and disappear, but before doing so she looked inquiringly about her. After she had entered, Clyde approached the house and studied it with great interest. What was his mother doing in there? Who was it she was going to see? He could scarcely have explained his intense curiosity to himself, and yet, since having thought that he had seen Esta on the street, he had an unconvinced feeling that it might have something to do with her. There were the letters, the $100, the furnished room in Montrose Street. Diagonally across the way from the house in Beaudry Street there was a large trunk tree, leafless now in the winter wind, and near it a telegraph pole, close enough to make a joint shadow with it. And behind these he was able to stand unseen, and from this vantage point to observe the several windows, side and front and ground and second floor. Through one of the front windows above, he saw his mother moving about as though she were quite at home there. And a moment later, to his astonishment, he saw Esta come to one of their two windows and put a package down on the sill. She appeared to have on only a light dressing gown or a wrap drawn about her shoulders. He was not mistaken this time. He actually started as he realized that it was she, also that his mother was in there with her. And yet what had she done that she must come back and hide away in this manner? Had her husband, the man she had run away with, deserted her? He was so intensely curious that he decided to wait a while outside here to see if his mother might not come out, and then he himself would call on Esta. He wanted so much to see her again, to know what this mystery was all about. He waited, thinking how he had always liked Esta and how strange it was that she should be here, hiding away in this mysterious way. After an hour, his mother came out, her basket apparently empty, for she held it lightly in her hand. And just as before, she looked cautiously about her, her face wearing that same stolid and yet care-stamped expression which it always wore these days, a cross between an uplifting faith and a troublesome doubt. Clyde watched her as she proceeded to walk south on Beaudry Street toward the Mission. After she was well out of sight, he turned and entered the house. Inside, as he had surmised, he found a collection of furnished rooms, nameplates some of which bore the names of the roomers pasted upon them. Since he knew that the southeast front room upstairs contained Esta, he proceeded there and knocked. And true enough, a light footstep responded within, and presently, after some little delay which seemed to suggest some quick preparation within, the door opened slightly and Esta peeped out, quizzically at first, then with a little cry of astonishment and some confusion. For, as inquiry and caution disappeared, she realized that she was looking at Clyde. At once she opened the door wide. "Why, Clyde," she called. "How did you come to find me? I was just thinking of you." Clyde at once put his arms around her and kissed her. At the same time he realized, and with a slight sense of shock and dissatisfaction, that she was considerably changed. She was thinner, paler, her eyes almost sunken, and not any better dressed than when he had seen her last. She appeared nervous and depressed. One of the first thoughts that came to him now was where her husband was. Why wasn't he here? What had become of him? As he looked about and at her, he noticed that Esta's look was one of confusion and uncertainty, not unmixed with a little satisfaction at seeing him. Her mouth was partly open because of a desire to smile and to welcome him, but her eyes showed that she was contending with a problem. "I didn't expect you here," she added, quickly, the moment he released her. "You didn't see," then she paused, catching herself at the brink of some information which evidently she didn't wish to impart. "Yes, I did, too, I saw Ma," he replied. "That's how I came to know you were here. I saw her coming out just now and I saw you up here through the window." He did not care to confess that he had been following and watching his mother for an hour, "But when did you get back?" he went on. "It's a wonder you wouldn't let the rest of us know something about you. Gee, you're a dandy, you are, going away and staying months and never letting any one of us know anything. You might have written me a little something, anyhow. We always got along pretty well, didn't we?" His glance was quizzical, curious, imperative. She, for her part, felt recessive and then evasive, uncertain, quite, what to think or say or tell. She uttered, "I couldn't think who it might be. No one comes here. But, my, how nice you look, Clyde. You've got such nice clothes, now. And you're getting taller. Mama was telling me you are working at the Green Davidson." She looked at him admiringly and he was properly impressed by her notice of him. At the same time he could not get his mind off her condition. He could not cease looking at her face, her eyes, her thin fat body. And as he looked at her waist and her gaunt face, he came to a very keen realization that all was not well with her. She was going to have a child. And hence the thought recurred to him, where was her husband, or at any rate, the man she had eloped with? Her original note, according to her mother, had said that she was going to get married. Yet now he sensed quite clearly that she was not married. She was deserted, left in this miserable room here alone. He saw it, felt it, understood it. And he thought at once that this was typical of all that seemed to occur in his family. Here he was just getting a start, trying to be somebody and get along in the world and have a good time. And here was Esta, after her first venture in the direction of doing something for herself, coming to such a finish as this. It made him a little sick and resentful. "How long have you been back, Esta?" he repeated dubiously, scarcely knowing just what to say now, for now that he was here and she was as she was he began to scent expense, trouble, distress and to wish almost that he had not been so curious. Why need he have been? It could only mean that he must help. "Oh, not so very long, Clyde. About a month, now, I guess. Not more than that." "I thought so. I saw you up on 11th near Baltimore about a month ago, didn't I?" "Sure I did," he added a little less joyously, a change that Esta noted. At the same time she nodded her head affirmatively. "I knew I did. I told Ma so at the time, but she didn't seem to think so. She wasn't as surprised as I thought she would be, though. I know why, now. She acted as though she didn't want me to tell her about it either. But I knew I wasn't wrong." He stared at Esta oddly, quite proud of his prescience in this case. He paused though, not knowing quite what else to say and wondering whether what he had just said was of any sense or import. It didn't seem to suggest any real aid for her. And she, not quite knowing how to pass over the nature of her condition, or to confess it, either, was puzzled what to say. Something had to be done. For Clyde could see for himself that her predicament was dreadful. She could scarcely bear the look of his inquiring eyes, and more to extricate herself than her mother, she finally observed, "Poor Mama. You mustn't think it strange of her, Clyde. She doesn't know what to do, you see, really. It's all my fault, of course. If I hadn't run away, I wouldn't have caused her all this trouble. She has so little to do with and she's always had such a hard time." She turned her back to him suddenly, and her shoulders began to tremble and her sides to heave. She put her hands to her face and bent her head low, and then he knew that she was silently crying. "Oh, come now, sis," exclaimed Clyde, drawing near to her instantly and feeling intensely sorry for her at the moment. "What's the matter? What do you want to cry for? Didn't that man that you went away with marry you?" She shook her head negatively and sobbed the more. And in that instant there came to Clyde the real psychological as well as sociological and biological import of his sister's condition. She was in trouble, pregnant, and with no money and no husband. That was why his mother had been looking for a room. That was why she had tried to borrow $100 from him. She was ashamed of Esta and her condition. She was ashamed of not only what people outside the family would think, but of what he and Julia and Frank might think, the effect of Esta's condition upon them perhaps, because it was not right, unmoral, as people saw it. And for that reason she had been trying to conceal it, telling stories about it, a most amazing and difficult thing for her, no doubt. And yet, because of poor luck, she hadn't succeeded very well. And now he was again confused and puzzled, not only by his sister's condition and what it meant to him and the other members of the family here in Kansas City, but also by his mother's disturbed and somewhat unmoral attitude in regard to deception in this instance. She had evaded if not actually deceived him in regard to all this, for she knew Esta was here all the time. At the same time he was not inclined to be too unsympathetic in that respect toward her, far from it. For such deception in such an instance had to be, no doubt, even where people were as religious and truthful as his mother, or so he thought. You couldn't just let people know. He certainly wouldn't want to let people know about Esta, if he could help it. What would they think? What would they say about her and him? Wasn't the general state of his family low enough, as it was? And so, now he stood, staring and puzzled the while Esta cried. And she, realizing that he was puzzled and ashamed, because of her, cried the more. "Gee, that is tough," said Clyde, troubled, and yet fairly sympathetic after a time. "You wouldn't have run away with him unless you cared for him though, would you?" He was thinking of himself and Hortense Briggs. "I'm sorry for you, S. Sure, I am, but it won't do you any good to cry about it now, will it? There's lots of other fellows in the world beside him. You'll come out of it all right." "Oh, I know," sobbed Esta, "but I've been so foolish. And I've had such a hard time. And now I've brought all this trouble on Mama and all of you." She choked and hushed a moment. "He went off and left me in a hotel in Pittsburgh without any money," she added. "And if it hadn't been for Mama, I don't know what I would have done. She sent me $100 when I wrote her. I worked for a while in a restaurant, as long as I could. I didn't want to write home and say that he had left me. I was ashamed to. But I didn't know what else to do there toward the last, when I began feeling so bad." She began to cry again, and Clyde, realizing all that his mother had done and sought to do to assist her, felt almost as sorry now for his mother as he did for Esta, more so, for Esta had her mother to look after her and his mother had almost no one to help her. "I can't work yet, because I won't be able to for a while," she went on. "And Mama doesn't want me to come home now because she doesn't want Julia or Frank or you to know. And that's right, too, I know. Of course it is. And she hasn't got anything and I haven't. And I get so lonely here, sometimes." Her eyes filled and she began to choke again. "And I've been so foolish." And Clyde felt for the moment as though he could cry too. For life was so strange, so hard at times. See how it had treated him all these years. He had had nothing until recently and always wanted to run away. But Esta had done so, and see what had befallen her. And somehow he recalled her between the tall walls of the big buildings here in the business district, sitting at his father's little street organ and singing and looking so innocent and good. Gee, life was tough. What a rough world it was anyhow. How queer things went. He looked at her and the room, and finally, telling her that she wouldn't be left alone, and that he would come again, only she mustn't tell his mother he had been there, and that if she needed anything she could call on him, although he wasn't making so very much, either, and then went out. And then, walking toward the hotel to go to work, he kept dwelling on the thought of how miserable it all was, how sorry he was that he had followed his mother, for then he might not have known. But even so, it would have come out. His mother could not have concealed it from him indefinitely. She would have asked for more money eventually maybe. But what a dog that man was to go off and leave his sister in a big strange city without a dime. He puzzled, thinking now of the girl who had been deserted in the Green Davidson some months before with a room and board bill unpaid. And how comic it had seemed to him and the other boys at the time, highly colored with a sensual interest in it. But this, well, this was his own sister. A man had thought so little of his sister as that. And yet, try as he would, he could no longer think that it was as terrible as when he heard her crying in the room. Here was this brisk, bright city about him running with people and effort, and this gay hotel in which he worked. That was not so bad. Besides, there was his own love affair, Hortense, and pleasures. There must be some way out for Esta. She would get well again and be all right. But to think of his being part of a family that was always so poor and so little thought of that things like this could happen to it, one thing and another, like street preaching, not being able to pay the rent at times, his father selling rugs and clocks for a living on the streets, Esta running away and coming to an end like this. Chapter 14. The result of all this on Clyde was to cause him to think more specifically on the problem of the sexes than he ever had before, and by no means in any orthodox way. For while he condemned his sister's lover for thus ruthlessly deserting her, still he was not willing to hold her entirely blameless by any means. She had gone off with him. As he now learned from her, he had been in the city for a week the year before she ran away with him, and it was then that he had introduced himself to her. The following year when he returned for 2 weeks, it was she who looked him up, or so Clyde suspected, at any rate. And in view of his own interest in and mood regarding Hortense Briggs, it was not for him to say that there was anything wrong with the sex relation in itself. Rather, as he saw it now, the difficulty lay, not in the deed itself, but in the consequences which followed upon not thinking or not knowing. For had Esta known more of the man in whom she was interested, more of what such a relationship with him meant, she would not be in her present pathetic plight. Certainly such girls as Hortense Briggs, Greta, and Louise, would never have allowed themselves to be put in any such position as Esta. Or would they? They were too shrewd. And by contrast with them in his mind, at least at this time, she suffered. She ought, as he saw it, to have been able to manage better. And so, by degrees, his attitude toward her hardened in some measure, though his feeling was not one of indifference either. But the one influence that was affecting and troubling and changing him now was his infatuation for Hortense Briggs, than which no more agitating influence could have come to a youth of his years and temperament. She seemed, after his few contacts with her, to be really the perfect realization of all that he had previously wished for in a girl. She was so bright, vain, engaging, and so truly pretty. Her eyes, as they seemed to him, had a kind of dancing fire in them. She had a most entrancing way of pursing and parting her lips and at the same time looking straightly and indifferently before her, as though she were not thinking of him, which to him was both flame and fever. It caused him, actually, to feel weak and dizzy, at times, cruelly seared in his veins with minute and wriggling threads of fire, and this could only be described as conscious lust, a torturesome and yet unescapable thing which yet in her case he was unable to prosecute beyond embracing and kissing, a form of reserve and respect in regard to her which she really resented in the very youths in whom she sought to inspire it. The type of boy for whom she really cared and was always seeking was one who could sweep away all such pseudo-ingenuousness and superiorities in her and force her, even against herself, to yield to him. In fact, she was constantly wavering between actual like and dislike of him. And in consequence, he was in constant doubt as to where he stood, a state which was very much relished by her and yet which was never permitted to become so fixed in his mind as to cause him to give her up entirely. After some party or dinner or theater to which she had permitted him to take her, and throughout which he had been particularly tactful, not too assertive, she could be as yielding and enticing in her mood as the most ambitious lover would have liked. And this might last until the evening was nearly over, when suddenly, and at her own door or the room or house of some girl with whom she was spending the night, she would turn, and without rhyme or reason, endeavor to dismiss him with a mere handclasp or a thinly flavored embrace or kiss. At such times, if Clyde was foolish enough to endeavor to force her to yield the favors he craved, she would turn on him with the fury of a spiteful cat, would tear herself away, developing for the moment, seemingly, an intense mood of opposition which she could scarcely have explained to herself. Its chief mental content appeared to be one of opposition to being compelled by him to do anything. And, because of his infatuation and his weak overtures due to his inordinate fear of losing her, he would be forced to depart, usually in a dark and despondent mood. But so keen was her attraction for him that he could not long remain away, but must be going about to where most likely he would encounter her. Indeed, for the most part these days, and in spite of the peculiar climax which had eventuated in connection with Esta, he lived in a keen, sweet and sensual dream in regard to her. If only she would really come to care for him. At night, in his bed at home, he would lie and think of her, her face, the expressions of her mouth and eyes, the lines of her figure, the motions of her body in walking or dancing, and she would flicker before him as upon a screen. In his dreams, he found her deliciously near him, pressing against him, her delightful body all his, and then in the moment of crisis, when seemingly she was about to yield herself to him completely, he would awake to find her vanished, an illusion only. Yet there were several things in connection with her which seemed to bode success for him. In the first place, like himself, she was part of a poor family, the daughter of a machinist and his wife, who up to this very time had achieved little more than a bare living. From her childhood she had had nothing, only such gewgaws and fripperies as she could secure for herself by her wits. And so low had been her social state until very recently that she had not been able to come in contact with anything better than butcher and baker boys, the rather commonplace urchins and small job aspirants of her vicinity. Yet even here she had early realized that she could and should capitalize her looks and charm, and had. Not a few of these had even gone so far as to steal in order to get money to entertain her. After reaching the age where she was old enough to go to work, and thus coming in contact with the type of boy and man in whom she was now interested, she was beginning to see that without yielding herself too much, but in acting discreetly, she could win a more interesting equipment than she had before. Only, so truly sensual and pleasure-loving was she that she was by no means always willing to divorce her self-advantages from her pleasures. On the contrary, she was often troubled by a desire to like those whom she sought to use, and per contra, not to obligate herself to those whom she could not like. In Clyde's case, liking him but a little, she still could not resist the desire to use him. She liked his willingness to buy her any little thing in which she appeared interested, a bag, a scarf, a purse, a pair of gloves, anything that she could reasonably ask or take without obligating herself too much. And yet from the first, in her smart, tricky way, she realized that unless she could bring herself to yield to him, at some time or other offer him the definite reward which she knew he craved, she could not hold him indefinitely. One thought that stirred her more than anything else was that the way Clyde appeared to be willing to spend his money on her, she might easily get some quite expensive things from him, a pretty and rather expensive dress, perhaps, or a hat, or even a fur coat such as was then being shown and worn in the city, to say nothing of gold earrings, or a wristwatch, all of which she was constantly and enviously eyeing in the different shop windows. One day not so long after Clyde's discovery of his sister Esta, Hortense, walking along Baltimore Street near its junction with 15th, the smartest portion of the shopping section of the city, at the noon hour, with Dora Strine, another shop girl in her department store, saw in the window of one of the smaller and less exclusive fur stores of the city, a fur jacket of beaver that to her, viewed from the eye point of her own particular build, coloring and temperament, was exactly what she needed to strengthen mightily her very limited personal wardrobe. It was not such an expensive coat, worth possibly $100, but fashioned in such an individual way as to cause her to imagine that, Once invested with it, her own physical charm would register more than it ever had. Moved by this thought, she paused and exclaimed, "Oh, isn't that just the classiest, darlingest little coat you ever saw? Oh, do look at those sleeves, Doris." She clutched her companion violently by the arm. "Look at the collar. And the lining. And those pockets. Oh, dear." She fairly vibrated with the intensity of her approval and delight. "Oh, isn't that just too sweet for words? And the very kind of coat I've been thinking of since I don't know when. Oh, you pity sing!" she exclaimed, affectedly, thinking all at once as much of her own pose before the window and its effect on the passer-by as of the coat before her. "Oh, if I could only have Oa!" She clapped her hands admiringly, while Isidore Rubinstein, the elderly son of the proprietor, who was standing somewhat out of the range of her gaze at the moment, noted the gesture and her enthusiasm and decided forthwith that the coat must be worth at least $25 or $50 more to her, anyhow, in case she inquired for it. The firm had been offering it at $100. "Oh, ha!" he grunted. But being of a sensual and somewhat romantic turn, he also speculated to himself rather definitely as to the probable trading value, affectionately speaking, of such a coat. What, say, would the poverty and vanity of such a pretty girl as this cause her to yield for such a coat? In the meantime, however, Hortense, having gloated as long as her noontime hour would permit, had gone away, still dreaming and satiating her flaming vanity by thinking of how devastating she would look in such a coat. But she had not stopped to ask the price. Hence, the next day, feeling that she must look at it once more, she returned, only this time alone, and yet with no idea of being able to purchase it herself. On the contrary, she was only vaguely revolving the problem of how, assuming that the coat was sufficiently low in price, she could get it. At the moment she could think of no one. But seeing the coat once more, and also seeing Mr. Rubinstein Jr., inside-eyeing her in a most propitiatory and genial manner, she finally ventured in. "You like the coat, eh?" was Rubinstein's ingratiating comment as she opened the door. "Well, that shows you have good taste, I'll say. That's one of the nicest little coats we've ever had to show in this store yet. A real beauty, that. And how it would look on such a beautiful girl as you." He took it out of the window and held it up. "I seen you when you was looking at it yesterday." A gleam of greedy admiration was in his eye. And noting this, and feeling that a remote and yet not wholly unfriendly air would win her more consideration and courtesy than a more intimate one, Hortense merely said, "Yes? Yes, indeed. And I said right away, there's a girl that knows a really swell coat when she sees it." The flattering unction soothed, in spite of herself. "Look at that. Look at that," went on Mr. Rubinstein, turning the coat about and holding it before her. "Where in Kansas City will you find anything to equal that today? Look at this silk lining here, genuine Mallinson silk, and these slant pockets. And the buttons. You think those things don't make a different-looking coat? There ain't another one like it in Kansas City today, not one. And there won't be. We designed it ourselves and we never repeat our models. We protect our customers. But come back here." He led the way to a triple mirror at the back. "It takes the right person to wear a coat like this, to get the best effect out of it. Let me try it on you." And by the artificial light Hortense was now privileged to see how really fetching she did look in it. She cocked her head and twisted and turned and buried one small ear in the fur, while Mr. Rubinstein stood by, eyeing her with not a little admiration and almost rubbing his hands. "There now," he continued. "Look at that. What do you say to that, eh? Didn't I tell you it was the very thing for you? A find for you. A pick-up. You'll never get another coat like that in this city. If you do, I'll make you a present of this one." He came very near, extending his plump hands, palms up. "Well, I must say it does look smart on me," commented Hortense, her vainglorious soul yearning for it. "I can wear anything like this, though." She twisted and turned the more, forgetting him entirely and the effect her interest would have on his cost price. Then she added, "How much is it?" "Well, it's really a $200 coat," began Mr. Rubenstein artfully. Then, noting a shadow of relinquishment pass swiftly over Hortense's face, he added quickly, "That sounds like a lot of money, but of course we don't ask so much for it down here. 150 is our price. But if that coat was at Jarek's, that's what you'd pay for it and more. We haven't got the location here and we don't have to pay the higher ends. But it's worth every cent of 200. Why, I think that's a terrible price to ask for it, just awful," exclaimed Hortense sadly, beginning to remove the coat. She was feeling as though life were depriving her of nearly all that was worthwhile. "Why, at Biggs and Beck's they have lots of three-quarter mink and beaver coats for that much, and classy styles, too." Maybe. But not that coat," insisted Mr. Rubenstein stubbornly. "Just look at it again. Look at the collar. You mean to say you can find a coat like that up there? If you can, I'll buy the coat for you and sell it to you again for $100. Actually, this is a special coat. It's copied from one of the smartest coats that was in New York last summer before the season opened. It has class. You won't find no coat like this coat." "Oh, well, just the same, $150 is more than I can pay," commented Hortense dolefully, at the same time slipping on her old broadcloth jacket with the fur collar and cuffs, and edging toward the door. "Wait. You like the coat?" wisely observed Mr. Rubenstein, after deciding that even $100 was too much for her purse, unless it could be supplemented by some man's. "It's really a $200 coat. I'm telling you that straight. Our regular price is $150. But if you could bring me $125, since you want it so much, well, I'll let you have it for that. And that's like finding it. A stunning-looking girl like you oughtn't to have no trouble in finding a dozen fellows who would be glad to buy that coat and give it to you. I know I would, if I thought you would be nice to me." He beamed ingratiatingly up at her, and Hortense, sensing the nature of the overture and resenting it, from him, drew back slightly. At the same time she was not wholly displeased by the compliment involved. But she was not coarse enough, as yet, to feel that just anyone should be allowed to give her anything. Indeed not. It must be someone she liked, or at least someone that was enslaved by her. And yet, even as Mr. Rubenstein spoke, and for some time afterwards, her mind began running upon possible individuals, favorites, who, by the necromancy of her charm for them, might be induced to procure this coat for her. Charlie Wilkins, for instance, he of the Orpheus cigar store, who was most certainly devoted to her after his fashion, but a fashion, however, which did not suggest that he might do much for her without getting a good deal in return. And then there was Robert Kane, another youth, very tall, very cheerful and very ambitious in regard to her, who was connected with one of the local electric company's branch offices, but his position was not sufficiently lucrative, a mere entry clerk. Also he was too saving, always talking about his future. And again, there was Bert Gettler, the youth who had escorted her to the dance the night Clyde first met her, but who was little more than a giddy-headed dancing soul, one not to be relied upon in a crisis like this. He was only a shoe salesman, probably $20 a week, and most careful with his pennies. But there was Clyde Griffiths, the person who seemed to have real money and to be willing to spend it on her freely. So ran her thoughts swiftly at the time. But could she now, she asked herself, offhand, inveigle him into making such an expensive present as this? She had not favored him so very much, had for the most part treated him indifferently. Hence she was not sure, by any means. Nevertheless, as she stood there, debating the cost and the beauty of the coat, the thought of Clyde kept running through her mind. And all the while Mr. Rubenstein stood looking at her, vaguely sensing, after his fashion, the nature of the problem that was confronting her. "Well, little girl," he finally observed, "I see you'd like to have this coat, all right, and I'd like to have you have it, too. And now I'll tell you what I'll do, and better than that I can't do, and wouldn't for nobody else, not a person in this city. Bring me $115 anytime within the next few days, Monday or Wednesday or Friday, if the coat is still here, and you can have it. I'll do even better. I'll save it for you. How's that? Until next Wednesday or Friday. More than that no one would do for you, now, would they? He smirked and shrugged his shoulders and acted as though he were indeed doing her a great favor. And Hortense, going away, felt that if only she could take that coat at $115, she would be capturing a marvelous bargain. Also that she would be the smartest dressed girl in Kansas City beyond the shadow of a doubt. If only she could in some way get $115 before next Wednesday, or Friday. Chapter 15. As Hortense well knew, Clyde was pressing more and more hungrily toward that ultimate condescension on her part, which, though she would never have admitted it to him, was the privilege of two others. They were never together anymore without his insisting upon the real depth of her regard for him. Why was it, if she cared for him the least bit, that she refused to do this, that or the other, would not let him kiss her as much as he wished, would not let him hold her in his arms as much as he would like? She was always keeping dates with other fellows and breaking them or refusing to make them with him. What was her exact relationship toward these others? Did she really care more for them than she did for him? In fact, they were never together anywhere but what this problem of union was uppermost, and but thinly veiled. And she liked to think that he was suffering from repressed desire for her all of the time that she tortured him, and that the power to allay his suffering lay wholly in her, a sadistic trait which had for its soil Clyde's own masochistic yearning for her. However, in the face of her desire for the coat, his stature and interest for her were beginning to increase. In spite of the fact that only the morning before she had informed Clyde, with quite a flourish, that she could not possibly see him until the following Monday, that all her intervening nights were taken, nevertheless, the problem of the coat looming up before her, she now most eagerly planned to contrive an immediate engagement with him without appearing too eager. For by then she had definitely decided to endeavor to persuade him, if possible, to buy the coat for her. Only of course, she would have to alter her conduct toward him radically. She would have to be much sweeter, more enticing. Although she did not actually say to herself that now she might even be willing to yield herself to him, still basically that was what was in her mind. For quite a little while she was unable to think how to proceed. How was she to see him this day, or the next at the very latest? How should she go about putting before him the need of this gift, or loan, as she finally worded it to herself? She might hint that he could loan her enough to buy the coat and that later she would pay him back by degrees, yet once in possession of the coat she well knew that that necessity would never confront her. Or, if he did not have so much money on hand at one time, she could suggest that she might arrange with Mr. Rubenstein for a series of time payments which could be met by Clyde. In this connection her mind suddenly turned and began to consider how she could flatter and cajole Mr. Rubenstein into letting her have the coat on easy terms. She recalled that he had said he would be glad to buy the coat for her if he thought she would be nice to him. Her first scheme in connection with all this was to suggest to Louise Ratterer to invite her brother, Clyde, and a third youth by the name of Skull, who was dancing attendance upon Louise, to come to a certain dance hall that very evening, to which she was already planning to go with the more favored cigar clerk. Only now she intended to break that engagement and appear alone with Louise and Greta and announce that her proposed partner was ill. That would give her an opportunity to leave early with Clyde and with him walk past the Rubenstein store. But having the temperament of a spider that spins a web for flies, she foresaw that this might involve the possibility of Louise's explaining to Clyde or Ratterer that it was Hortense who had instigated the party. It might even bring up some accidental mention of the coat on the part of Clyde to Louise later, which, as she felt, would never do. She did not care to let her friends know how she provided for herself. In consequence, she decided that it would not do for her to appeal to Louise nor to Greta in this fashion. And she was actually beginning to worry as to how to bring about this encounter, when Clyde, who chanced to be in the vicinity on his way home from work, walked into the store where she was working. He was seeking for a date on the following Sunday. And to his intense delight, Hortense greeted him most cordially with a most engaging smile and a wave of the hand. She was busy at the moment with a customer. She soon finished, however, and drawing near, and keeping one eye on her floor walker who resented callers, exclaimed, "I was just thinking about you." "You wasn't thinking about me, was you?" Trade last. Then she added, sotto voce, "Don't act like you are talking to me. I see our floor walker over there." Arrested by the unusual sweetness in her voice, to say nothing of the warm smile with which she greeted him, Clyde was enlivened and heartened at once. "Was I thinking of you?" he returned gaily. "Do I ever think of anyone else? Say. Ratterer says I've got you on the brain." "Oh, him," replied Hortense, pouting spitefully and scornfully, for Ratterer, strangely enough, was one whom she did not interest very much, and this she knew. "He thinks he's so smart," she added. "I know a lot of girls don't like him." "Oh, Tom's all right," pleaded Clyde, loyally. "That's just his way of talking. He likes you." "Oh, no, he don't, either," replied Hortense. "But I don't want to talk about him. Whatcha doing around 6 o'clock tonight?" "Oh, gee!" exclaimed Clyde disappointedly. "You don't mean to say you got tonight free, have you? Well, ain't that tough? I thought you were all dated up." "I got to work." He actually sighed, so depressed was he by the thought that she might be willing to spend the evening with him and he not able to avail himself of the opportunity, while Hortense, noting his intense disappointment, was pleased. "Well, I got a date, but I don't want to keep it," she went on with a contemptuous gathering of the lips. "I don't have to break it. I would though if you was free." Clyde's heart began to beat rapidly with delight. "Gee, I wish I didn't have to work now," he went on, looking at her. "You're sure you couldn't make it tomorrow night? I'm off then. And I was just coming up here to ask you if you didn't want to go for an automobile ride next Sunday afternoon, maybe. A friend of Helen's got a car, a Packard, and Sunday we're all off. And he wanted me to get a bunch to run out to Excelsior Springs. He's a nice fellow," this because Hortense showed signs of not being so very much interested. "You don't know him very well, but he is. But say, I can talk to you about that later. How about tomorrow night?" "I'm off then." Hortense, who, because of the hovering floor walker, was pretending to show Clyde some handkerchiefs, was now thinking how unfortunate that a whole 24 hours must intervene before she could bring him to view the coat with her, and so have an opportunity to begin her machinations. At the same time she pretended that the proposed meeting for the next night was a very difficult thing to bring about, more difficult than he could possibly appreciate. She even pretended to be somewhat uncertain as to whether she wanted to do it. "Just pretend you're examining these handkerchiefs here," she continued, fearing the floor walker might interrupt. "I got another date for then," she continued thoughtfully, "and I don't know whether I can break it or not. Let me see." She feigned deep thought. "Well, I guess I can," she said finally. "I'll try, anyhow. Just for this once. You be here at 15th and Main at 6.15, no, 6.30's the best you can do, ain't it? And I'll see if I can't get there. I won't promise, but I'll see and I think I can make it. Is that all right?" She gave him one of her sweetest smiles and Clyde was quite beside himself with satisfaction. To think that she would break a date for him, at last. Her eyes were warm with favor and her mouth wreathed with a smile. "Surest thing you know," he exclaimed, voicing the slang of the hotel boys. "You bet I'll be there. Will you do me a favor?" "What is it?" she asked cautiously. "Wear that little black hat with the red ribbon under your chin, will you? You look so cute in that." "Oh, you," she laughed. It was so easy to kid Clyde. "Yes, I'll wear it," she added. "But you gotta go now. Here comes that old fish. I know he's going to kick. But I don't care. 6:30, eh? So long." She turned to give her attention to a new customer, an old lady who had been patiently waiting to inquire if she could tell her where the muslins were sold. And Clyde, tingling with pleasure because of this unexpected delight vouchsafed him, made his way most elatedly to the nearest exit. He was not made unduly curious because of this sudden favor, and the next evening, promptly at 6:30, and in the glow of the overhanging arc lights showering their glistening radiance like rain, she appeared. As he noted, at once, she had worn the hat he liked. Also she was enticingly ebullient and friendly, more so than at any time he had known her. Before he had time to say that she looked pretty, or how pleased he was because she wore that hat, she began, "Some favorite you're gettin' to be, I'll say, when I'll break an engagement and then wear an old hat I don't like just to please you. How do I get that way is what I'd like to know." He beamed as though he had won a great victory. Could it be that at last he might be becoming a favorite with her? "If you only knew how cute you look in that hat, Hortense, you wouldn't knock it," he urged admiringly. "You don't know how sweet you do look." "Oh, ho. In this old thing?" she scoffed. "You certainly are easily pleased, I'll say. And your eyes are just like soft, black velvet," he persisted eagerly. "They're wonderful." He was thinking of an alcove in the green Davidson hung with black velvet. "Gee, you certainly have got him tonight," she laughed, teasingly. "I'll have to do something about you." Then, before he could make any reply to this, she went off into an entirely fictional account of how, having had a previous engagement with a certain alleged young society man, Tom Carey by name, who was dogging her steps these days in order to get her to dine and dance, she had only this evening decided to ditch him, preferring Clyde, of course, for this occasion, anyhow. And she had called Carey up and told him that she could not see him tonight, called it all off, as it were. But just the same, on coming out of the employee's entrance, who should she see there waiting for her but this same Tom Carey, dressed to perfection in a bright gray raglan and spats, and with his closed sedan, too. And he would have taken her to the Green Davidson, if she had wanted to go. He was a real sport. But she didn't. Not tonight, anyhow. Yet, if she had not contrived to avoid him, he would have delayed her. But she espied him first and ran the other way. And you should have just seen my little feet twinkle up Sargent and around the corner into Bailey Place, was the way she narcissistically painted her flight. And so infatuated was Clyde by this picture of herself and the wonderful Carey that he accepted all of her petty fabrications as truth. And then, as they were walking in the direction of Gaspy's, a restaurant in Wyandotte near 10th which quite lately he had learned was much better than Frissel's, Hortense took occasion to pause and look in a number of windows, saying as she did so that she certainly did wish that she could find a little coat that was becoming to her, that the one she had on was getting worn and that she must have another soon, a predicament which caused Clyde to wonder at the time whether she was suggesting to him that he get her one. Also whether it might not advance his cause with her if he were to buy her a little jacket, since she needed it. But Rubinstein's coming into view on this same side of the street, its display window properly illuminated and the coat in full view, Hortense paused as she had planned. "Oh, do look at that darling little coat there," she began, ecstatically, as though freshly arrested by the beauty of it, her whole manner suggesting a first and unspoiled impression. "Oh, isn't that the dearest, sweetest, cutest little thing you ever did see?" she went on, her histrionic powers growing with her desire for it. "Oh, just look at the collar, and those sleeves and those pockets. Aren't they the snappiest things you ever saw? Couldn't I just warm my little hands in those?" She glanced at Clyde out of the tail of her eye to see if he was being properly impressed. And he, aroused by her intense interest, surveyed the coat with not a little curiosity. Unquestionably it was a pretty coat, very. But, gee, what would a coat like that cost, anyhow? Could it be that she was trying to interest him in the merits of a coat like that in order that he might get it for her? Why, it must be a $200 coat at least. He had no idea as to the value of such things, anyhow. He certainly couldn't afford a coat like that. And especially at this time when his mother was taking a good portion of his extra cash for Esta. And yet something in her manner seemed to bring it to him that that was exactly what she was thinking. It chilled and almost numbed him at first. And yet, as he now told himself sadly, if Hortense wanted it, she could most certainly find someone who would get it for her, that young Tom Carey, for instance, whom she had just been describing. And, worse luck, she was just that kind of a girl. And if he could not get it for her, someone else could, and she would despise him for not being able to do such things for her. To his intense dismay and dissatisfaction she exclaimed, "Oh, what wouldn't I give for a coat like that?" She had not intended at the moment to put the matter so bluntly, for she wanted to convey the thought that was deepest in her mind to Clyde tactfully. And Clyde, inexperienced as he was and not subtle by any means, was nevertheless quite able to gather the meaning of that. It meant, for the moment he was not quite willing to formulate to himself what it did mean. And now, if only he had the price of that coat. He could feel that she was thinking of some one certain way to get the coat. And yet how was he to manage it? How? If he could only arrange to get this coat for her, if he only could promise her that he would get it for her by a certain date, say, if it didn't cost too much, then what? Did he have the courage to suggest to her tonight, or tomorrow, say, after he had learned the price of the coat, that if she would, why then, well, he would get her the coat or anything else she really wanted. Only he must be sure that she was not really fooling him as she was always doing in smaller ways. He wouldn't stand for getting her the coat and then get nothing in return, never. As he thought of it, he actually thrilled and trembled beside her. And she, standing there and looking at the coat, was thinking that unless he had sense enough now to get her this thing and to get what she meant, how she intended to pay for it, well then, this was the last. He need not think she was going to fool around with anyone who couldn't or wouldn't do that much for her. Never. They resumed their walk toward Gatsby's. And throughout the dinner, she talked of little else, how attractive the coat was, how wonderful it would look on her. "Believe me," she said at one point, defiantly, feeling that Clyde was perhaps uncertain at the moment about his ability to buy it for her, "I'm going to find some way to get that coat. I think, maybe, that Rubenstein store would let me have it on time if I were to go in there and see him about it, make a big enough payment down. Another girl out of our store got a coat that way once," she lied promptly, hoping thus to induce Clyde to assist her with it. But Clyde, disturbed by the fear of some extraordinary cost in connection with it, hesitated to say just what he would do. He could not even guess the price of such a thing. It might cost $200 or $300 even, and he feared to obligate himself to do something which later he might not be able to do. "You don't know what they might want for that, do you?" he asked, nervously, at the same time thinking if he made any cash gift to her at this time without some guarantee on her part, what right would he have to expect anything more in return than he had ever received? He knew how she cajoled him into getting things for her and then would not even let him kiss her. He flushed and churned a little internally with resentment at the thought of how she seemed to feel that she could play fast and loose with him. And yet, as he now recalled, she had just said she would do anything for anyone who would get that coat for her, or nearly that. No, she hesitated at first, for the moment troubled as to whether to give the exact price or something higher. For if she asked for time, Mr. Rubenstein might want more. And yet if she said much more, Clyde might not want to help her. "But I know it wouldn't be more than $125. I wouldn't pay more than that for it." Clyde heaved a sigh of relief. After all, it wasn't $200 or $300. He began to think now that if she could arrange to make any reasonable down payment, say, $50 or $60, he might manage to bring it together within the next 2 or 3 weeks anyhow. But if the whole $125 were demanded at once, Hortense would have to wait, and besides he would have to know whether he was to be rewarded or not, definitely. "That's a good idea, Hortense," he exclaimed without, however, indicating in any way why it appealed to him so much. "Why don't you do that? Why don't you find out first what they want for it, and how much they want down? Maybe I could help you with it." "Oh, won't that be just too wonderful?" Hortense clapped her hands. "Oh, will you? Oh, Won't that be just dandy? Now I just know I can get that coat. I just know they'll let me have it, if I talk to them right." She was, as Clyde saw and feared, quite forgetting the fact that he was the one who was making the coat possible, and now it would be just as he thought. The fact that he was paying for it would be taken for granted. But a moment later, observing his glum face, she added, "Oh, aren't you the sweetest, dearest thing, to help me in this way? You just bet I won't forget this either. You just wait and see. You won't be sorry. Now you just wait." Her eyes fairly snapped with gaiety and even generosity toward him. He might be easy and young, but he wasn't mean, and she would reward him, too, she now decided. Just as soon as she got the coat, which must be in a week or two at the latest, she was going to be very nice to him, do something for him. And to emphasize her own thoughts and convey to him what she really meant, she allowed her eyes to grow soft and swimming and to dwell on him promisingly, a bit of romantic acting which caused him to become weak and nervous. The gusto of her favor frightened him even a little, for it suggested, as he fancied, a disturbing vitality which he might not be able to match. He felt a little weak before her now, a little cowardly, in the face of what he assumed her real affection might mean. Nevertheless, he now announced that if the coat did not cost more than $125, that sum to be broken into one payment of $25 down and two additional sums of $50 each, he could manage it. And she on her part replied that she was going the very next day to see about it. Mr. Rubenstein might be induced to let her have it at once on the payment of $25 down, if not that, then at the end of the second week, when nearly all would be paid. And then in real gratitude to Clyde she whispered to him, coming out of the restaurant and purring like a cat, that she would never forget this and that he would see, and that she would wear it for him the very first time. If he were not working they might go somewhere to dinner. Or, if not that, then she would have it surely in time for the day of the proposed automobile ride which he, or rather Helland, had suggested for the following Sunday, but which might be postponed. She suggested that they go to a certain dance hall, and there she clung to him in the dances in a suggestive way and afterwards hinted of a mood which made Clyde a little quivery and erratic. He finally went home, dreaming of the day, satisfied that he would have no trouble in bringing together the first payment, if it were so much as 50, even. For now, under the spur of this promise, he proposed to borrow as much as 25 from either Ratterer or Helland, and to repay it after the coat was paid for. But, the beautiful Hortense! The charm of her, the enormous, compelling, weakening delight. And to think that at last, and soon, she was to be his. It was, plainly, of such stuff as dreams are made of, the unbelievable become real. Chapter 16. True to her promise, the following day Hortense returned to Mr. Rubenstein, and with all the cunning of her nature placed before him, with many reservations, the nature of the dilemma which confronted her. Could she, by any chance, have the coat for $115 on an easy payment plan? Mr. Rubenstein's head forthwith began to wag a solemn negative. This was not an easy payment store. If he wanted to do business that way he could charge $200 for the coat and easily get it. But I could pay as much as $50 when I took the coat, argued Hortense. Very good. But who is to guarantee that I get the other 65, and when? Next week 25, and the week after that 25 and the next week after that 15. Of course. But suppose in the next day after you take the coat an automobile runs you down and kills you. Then what? How do I get my money? Now that was a poser. And there was really no way that she could prove that anyone would pay for the coat. And before that there would have to be all the bother of making out a contract, and getting some really responsible person, a banker, say, to endorse it. No, this was not an easy payment house. This was a cash house. That was why the coat was offered to her at $115, but not a dollar less. Not a dollar. Mr. Rubenstein sighed and talked on. and finally Hortense asked him if she could give him $75 cash in hand, the other 40 to be paid in 1 week's time. Would he let her have the coat then, to take home with her? But a week, what is a week then? Argued Mr. Rubenstein. If you can bring me 75 next week or tomorrow, and 40 more in another week or 10 days, why not wait a week and bring the whole 115? Then the coat is yours and no bother. Leave the coat. Come back tomorrow and pay me $25 or $30 on account and I take the coat out of the window and lock it up for you. No one can even see it then. In another week bring me the balance or in 2 weeks. Then it is yours. Mr. Rubenstein explained the process as though it were a difficult matter to grasp. But the argument once made was sound enough. It really left Hortense little to argue about. At the same time it reduced her spirit not a little. To think of not being able to take it now. And yet, once out of the place, her vigor revived. For, after all, the time fixed would soon pass and if Clyde performed his part of the agreement promptly, the coat would be hers. The important thing now was to make him give her $25 or $30 wherewith to bind this wonderful agreement. Only now, because of the fact that she felt that she needed a new hat to go with the coat, she decided to say that it cost $125 instead of $115. And once this conclusion was put before Clyde, he saw it as a very reasonable arrangement, all things considered, quite a respite from the feeling of strain that had settled upon him after his last conversation with Hortense. For, after all, he had not seen how he was to raise more than $35 this first week anyhow. The following week would be somewhat easier, for then, as he told himself, he proposed to borrow 20 or 25 from Ratterer if he could, which, joined with the 20 or 25 which his tips would bring him, would be quite sufficient to meet the second payment. The week following he proposed to borrow at least 10 or 15 from Helland, maybe more, and if that did not make up the required amount to pawn his watch for $15, the watch he had bought for himself a few months before. It ought to bring that at least, it cost $50. But, he now thought, there was Esta in her wretched room awaiting the most unhappy result of her one romance. How was she to make out, he asked himself, even in the face of the fact that he feared to be included in the financial problem which Esta as well as the family presented. His father was not now, and never had been, of any real financial service to his mother. And yet, if the problem were on this account to be shifted to him, how would he make out? Why need his father always peddle clocks and rugs and preach on the streets? Why couldn't his mother and father give up the mission idea, anyhow? But, as he knew, the situation was not to be solved without his aid. And the proof of it came toward the end of the second week of his arrangement with Hortense, when, with $50 in his pocket, which he was planning to turn over to her on the following Sunday, his mother, looking into his bedroom where he was dressing, said, "I'd like to see you for a minute, Clyde, before you go out." He noted she was very grave as she said this. As a matter of fact, for several days past, he had been sensing that she was undergoing a strain of some kind. At the same time he had been thinking all this while that with his own resources hypothecated as they were, he could do nothing. Or, if he did it meant the loss of Hortense. He dared not. And yet what reasonable excuse could he give his mother for not helping her a little, considering especially the clothes he wore, and the manner in which he had been running here and there, always giving the excuse of working, but probably not deceiving her as much as he thought. To be sure, only 2 months before, he had obligated himself to pay her $10 a week more for 5 weeks, and had. But that only proved to her very likely that he had so much extra to give, even though he had tried to make it clear at the time that he was pinching himself to do it. And yet, however much he chose to waver in her favor, he could not, with his desire for Hortense directly confronting him. He went out into the living room after a time, and as usual his mother at once led the way to one of the benches in the mission, a cheerless, cold room these days. "I didn't think I'd have to speak to you about this, Clyde, but I don't see any other way out of it. I haven't anyone but you to depend upon now that you're getting to be a man. But you must promise not to tell any of the others, Frank or Julia or your father. I don't want them to know. But Esther's back here in Kansas City and in trouble, and I don't know quite what to do about her. I have so very little money to do with, and your father's not very much of a help to me anymore." She passed a weary, reflective hand across her forehead, and Clyde knew what was coming. His first thought was to pretend that he did not know that Esther was in the city, since he had been pretending this way for so long. But now, suddenly, in the face of his mother's confession, and the need of pretended surprise on his part, if he were to keep up the fiction, he said, "Yes, I know." "You know?" queried his mother, surprised. "Yes, I know," Clyde repeated. "I saw you going in that house in Beaudry Street one morning as I was going along there," he announced calmly enough now. "And I saw Esther looking out of the window afterwards, too, so I went in after you left." "How long ago was that?" she asked, more to gain time than anything else. "Oh, about 5 or 6 weeks ago, I think. I've been around to see her a couple of times since then, only Esther didn't want me to say anything about that either." "TST. TST. TST," clicked Mrs. Griffiths, with her tongue. "Then you know what the trouble is." "Yes," replied Clyde. "Well, what is to be will be," she said resignedly. "You haven't mentioned it to Frank or Julia, have you?" "No," replied Clyde, thoughtfully, thinking of what a failure his mother had made of her attempt to be secretive. She was no one to deceive anyone, or his father, either. He thought himself far, far shrewder. "Well, you mustn't," cautioned his mother solemnly. "It isn't best for them to know, I think. It's bad enough as it is this way," she added with a kind of wry twist to her mouth, the while Clyde thought of himself and Hortense. "And to think," she added, after a moment, her eyes filling with a sad, all-enveloping gray mist, "she should have brought all this on herself and on us. And when we have so little to do with, as it is. And after all the instruction she has had, the training. The way of the transgressor." She shook her head and put her two large hands together and gripped them firmly, while Clyde stared, thinking of the situation and all that it might mean to him. She sat there, quite reduced and bewildered by her own peculiar part in all this. She had been as deceiving as anyone, really. And here was Clyde, now, fully informed as to her falsehoods and strategy, and herself looking foolish and untrue. But had she not been trying to save him from all this, him and the others? And he was old enough to understand that now. Yet she now proceeded to explain why, and to say how dreadful she felt it all to be. At the same time, as she also explained, now she was compelled to come to him for aid in connection with it. "Esther's about to be very sick," she went on suddenly and stiffly, not being able, or at least willing, apparently, to look at Clyde as she said it, and yet determined to be as frank as possible. "She'll need a doctor very shortly and someone to be with her all the time when I'm not there. I must get money somewhere, at least $50. You couldn't get me that much in some way, from some of your young men friends, could you, just a loan for a few weeks? You could pay it back, you know, soon, if you would. You wouldn't need to pay me anything for your room until you had." She looked at Clyde so tensely, so urgently, that he felt quite shaken by the force of the cogency of the request. And before he could add anything to the nervous gloom which shadowed her face, she added, that other money was for her, you know, to bring her back here after her she hesitated over the appropriate word but finally added, husband left her there in Pittsburgh. "I suppose she told you that?" "Yes, she did," replied Clyde, heavily and sadly. For after all, Esther's condition was plainly critical, which was something that he had not stopped to meditate on before. "Gee, Ma," he exclaimed, the thought of the $50 in his pocket and its intended destination troubling him considerably, the very sum his mother was seeking. "I don't know whether I can do that or not. I don't know any of the boys down there well enough for that. And they don't make any more than I do, either. I might borrow a little something, but it won't look very good." He choked and swallowed a little, for lying to his mother in this way was not easy. In fact, he had never had occasion to lie in connection with anything so trying, and so despicably. For here was $50 in his pocket at the moment, with Hortense on the one hand and his mother and sister on the other, and the money would solve his mother's problem as fully as it would Hortense's, and more respectably. How terrible it was not to help her. How could he refuse her, really? Nervously he licked his lips and passed a hand over his brow, for a nervous moisture had broken out upon his face. He felt strained and mean and incompetent under the circumstances. "And you haven't any money of your own right now that you could let me have you?" his mother half pleaded. For there were a number of things in connection with Esther's condition which required immediate cash and she had so little. "No, I haven't, Ma," he said, looking at his mother shamefacedly, for a moment, then away, and if it had not been that she herself was so distrait, she might have seen the falsehood on his face. As it was, he suffered a pang of commingled self-commiseration and self-contempt, based on the distress he felt for his mother. He could not bring himself to think of losing Hortense. He must have her. And yet his mother looked so lone and so resourceless. It was shameful. He was low, really mean. Might he not, later, be punished for a thing like this? He tried to think of some other way, some way of getting a little money over and above the 50 that might help. If only he had a little more time, a few weeks longer. If only Hortense had not brought up this coat idea just now. "I'll tell you what I might do," he went on, quite foolishly and dully the while his mother gave vent to a helpless TST. "TST. TST. Will $5 do you any good?" "Well, it will be something, anyhow," she replied. "I can use it." "Well, I can let you have that much," he said, thinking to replace it out of his next week's tips and trust to better luck throughout the week. "And I'll see what I can do next week. I might let you have 10 then. I can't say for sure. I had to borrow some of that other money I gave you, and I haven't got through paying for that yet, and if I come around trying to get more, they'll think, well, you know how it is." His mother sighed, thinking of the misery of having to fall back on her one son thus far. And just when he was trying to get a start, too. What would he think of all this in after years? What would he think of her, of Esther, the family? For all his ambition and courage and desire to be out and doing, Clyde always struck her as one who was not any too powerful physically or rock-ribbed morally or mentally. So far as his nerves and emotions were concerned, at times he seemed to take after his father more than he did after her. And for the most part it was so easy to excite him, to cause him to show tenseness and strain, as though he were not so very well fitted for either. And it was she, because of Esther and her husband and their joint and unfortunate lives, that was and had been heaping the greater part of this strain on him. "Well, if you can't, you can't," she said. "I must try and think of some other way." But she saw no clear way at the moment. Chapter 17. In connection with the automobile ride suggested and arranged for the following Sunday by Helen through his chauffeur friend, a change of plan was announced. The car, an expensive Packard, no less, could not be had for that day, but must be used by this Thursday or Friday, or not at all. For, as had been previously explained to all, but not with the strictest adherence to the truth, the car belonged to a certain Mr. Kimbark, an elderly and very wealthy man who at the time was traveling in Asia. Also, what was not true was that this particular youth was not Mr. Kimbark's chauffeur at all, but rather the rakish, ne'er-do-well son of Sparser, the superintendent of one of Mr. Kimbark's stock farms. This son being anxious to pose as something more than the son of a superintendent of a farm, and as an occasional watchman, having access to the cars, had decided to take the very finest of them and ride in it. It was Helen who proposed that he and his hotel friends be included on some interesting trip. But since the general invitation had been given, word had come that within the next few weeks Mr. Kimbark was likely to return. And because of this, Willard Sparser had decided at once that it might be best not to use the car anymore. He might be taken unawares, perhaps, by Mr. Kim Bark's unexpected arrival. Laying this difficulty before Helland, who was eager for the trip, the latter had scouted the idea. Why not use it once more anyhow? He had stirred up the interest of all of his friends in this and now hated to disappoint them. The following Friday, between noon and 6 o'clock, was fixed upon as the day. And since Hortense had changed in her plan, she now decided to accompany Clyde, who had been invited, of course. But as Helland had explained to Ratterer and Higby, since it was being used without the owner's consent, they must meet rather far out, the men in one of the quiet streets near 17th and West Prospect, from which point they could proceed to a meeting place more convenient for the girls, namely, 20th and Washington. From thence they would speed via the West Parkway and the Hannibal Bridge north and east to Harlem, North Kansas City, Manaville, and so through Liberty and Mosby to Excelsior Springs. Their chief objective there was a little inn, the Wigwam, a mile or two this side of Excelsior, which was open the year round. It was really a combination of restaurant and dancing parlor and hotel. A Victrola and Wurlitzer player piano furnished the necessary music. Such groups as this were not infrequent, and Helland as well as Higby, who had been there on several occasions, described it as dandy. The food was good and the road to it excellent. There was a little river just below it where in the summer time at least there was rowing and fishing. In winter some people skated when there was ice. To be sure, at this time, January, the road was heavily packed with snow, but easy to get over, and the scenery fine. There was a little lake, not so far from Excelsior, at this time of year also frozen over, and according to Helland, who was always unduly imaginative and high-spirited, they might go there and skate. "Will you listen to who's talkin' about skatin' on a trip like this?" commented Ratterer, rather cynically, for to his way of thinking this was no occasion for any such side athletics, but for lovemaking exclusively. "Aw, hell, can't a fellow have a funny idea even without bein' roasted for it?" retorted the author of the idea, the only one, apart from Sparser, who suffered any qualms in connection with all this was Clyde himself. For to him, from the first, the fact that the car to be used did not belong to Sparser, but to his employer, was disturbing, almost irritatingly so. He did not like the idea of taking anything that belonged to anyone else, even for temporary use. Something might happen. They might be found out. "Don't you think it's dangerous for us to be going out in this car?" he asked of Ratterer a few days before the trip, and when he fully understood the nature of the source of the car. "Oh, I don't know," replied Ratterer, who being accustomed to such ideas and devices as this was not much disturbed by them. "I'm not taking the car and you're not, are you? If he wants to take it, that's his lookout, ain't it? If he wants me to go, I'll go. Why wouldn't I? All I want is to be brought back here on time. That's the only thing that would ever worry me." And Higby, coming up at the moment, had voiced exactly the same sentiments. Yet Clyde remained troubled. It might not work out right, he might lose his job through a thing like this. But so fascinated was he by the thought of riding in such a fine car with Hortense and with all these other girls and boys that he could not resist the temptation to go. Immediately after noon on the Friday of this particular week, the several participants of the outing were gathered at the points agreed upon. Helland, Ratterer, Higby and Clyde at 18th and West Prospect near the railroad yards. Maida Axelrod, Helland's girl, Lucille Nicholas, a friend of Ratterer's, and Tina Kogel, a friend of Higby's, also Laura Sipe, another girl who was brought by Tina Kogel to be introduced to Sparser for the occasion, at 20th and Washington. Only since Hortense had sent word at the last moment to Clyde that she had to go out to her house for something, and that they were to run out to 49th and Genesee, where she lived, they did so, but not without grumbling. The day, a late January one, was inclined to be smoky with lowering clouds, especially within the environs of Kansas City. It even threatened snow at times, a most interesting and picturesque prospect to those within. They liked it. Oh, Gee, I hope it does, Tina Kogel exclaimed when someone commented on the possibility, and Lucille Nicholas added, "Oh, I just love to see it snow at times." Along the West Bluff Road, Washington, and 2nd Streets, they finally made their way across the Hannibal Bridge to Harlem, and from thence along the winding and hill-sentineled River Road to Randolph Heights and Manaville. And beyond that came Mosby and Liberty, to and through which the roadbed was better, with interesting glimpses of small homesteads and the bleak snow-covered hills of January. Clyde, who for all his years in Kansas City had never ventured much beyond Kansas City, Kansas, on the west, or the primitive and natural woods of Swope Park on the east, nor farther along the Kansas or Missouri rivers than Argentine on the one side and Randolph Heights on the other, was quite fascinated by the idea of travel which appeared to be suggested by all this distant travel. It was also different from his ordinary routine. And on this occasion Hortense was inclined to be very genial and friendly. She snuggled down beside him on the seat, and when he, noting that the others had already drawn their girls to them in affectionate embraces, put his arm about her and drew her to him, she made no particular protest. Instead she looked up and said, "I'll have to take my hat off, I guess." The others laughed. There was something about her quick, crisp way which was amusing at times. Besides, she had done her hair in a new way which made her look decidedly prettier, and she was anxious to have the others see it. "Can we dance anywhere out here?" she called to the others, without looking around. "Surest thing you know," said Higby, who by now had persuaded Tina Kogel to take her hat off and was holding her close. "They got a player piano and a Victrola out there. If I'd a thought, I'd a brought my cornet. I can play Dixie on that." The car was speeding at breakneck pace over a snowy white road and between white fields. In fact, Sparser, considering himself a master of car manipulation as well as the real owner of it for the moment, was attempting to see how fast he could go on such a road. Dark vignettes of wood went by to right and left. Fields away, sentinel hills rose and fell like waves. A wide-armed scarecrow fluttering in the wind, its tall decayed hat or eye, stood near at hand in one place. And from near it a flock of crows rose and winged direct toward a distant wood lightly penciled against a foreground of snow. In the front seat sat Sparser, guiding the car beside Laura Sipe with the air of one to whom such a magnificent car was a commonplace thing. He was really more interested in Hortense, yet felt it incumbent on him, for the time being, anyhow, to show some attention to Laura Sipe. And not to be outdone in gallantry by the others, he now put one arm about Laura Sipe while he guided the car with the other, a feat which troubled Clyde, who was still dubious about the wisdom of taking the car at all. They might all be wrecked by such fast driving. Hortense was only interested by the fact that Sparser had obviously manifested his interest in her, that he had to pay some attention to Laura Sipe whether he wanted to or not. And when she saw him pull her to him and asked her grandly if she had done much automobiling about Kansas City, she merely smiled to herself. But Ratterer, noting the move, nudged Lucille Nicholas, and she in turn nudged Higby, in order to attract his attention to the affectional development ahead. "Getting comfortable up front there, Willard?" called Ratterer, genially, in order to make friends with him. "I'll say I am," replied Sparser, gaily and without turning. "How about you, girlie?" "Oh, I'm all right," Laura Sipe replied. But Clyde was thinking that of all the girls present none was really so pretty as Hortense, not nearly. She had come garbed in a red and black dress with a very dark red poke bonnet to match. And on her left cheek, just below her small rouged mouth, she had pasted a minute square of black court plaster in imitation of some picture beauty she had seen. In fact, before the outing began, she had been determined to outshine all the others present, and distinctly she was now feeling that she was succeeding. And Clyde, for himself, was agreeing with her. "You're the cutest thing here," whispered Clyde, hugging her fondly. "Gee, but you can pour on the molasses, kid, when you want to," she called out loud, and the others laughed. And Clyde flushed slightly. Beyond Minaville about 6 miles the car came to a bend in a hollow where there was a country store, and here Helland, Higby and Ratterer got out to fetch candy, cigarettes and ice cream cones and ginger ale. And after that came Liberty, and then several miles this side of Excelsior Springs, they sighted the wigwam, which was nothing more than an old 2-story farmhouse snuggled against a rise of ground behind it. There was, however, adjoining it on one side a newer and larger 1-story addition consisting of the dining room, the dance floor, and concealed by a partition at one end, a bar. An open fire flickered cheerfully here in a large fireplace. Down in a hollow across the road might be seen the Benton River or creek, now frozen solid. "There's your river," called Higby cheerfully as he helped Tina Kogel out of the car, for he was already very much warmed by several drinks he had taken en route. They all paused for a moment to admire the stream, winding away among the trees. "I wanted dis bunch to bring diver skates and go down daver," sighed Helland, "but dey wouldn't." "Well, dat's all right." By then Lucille Nicholas, seeing a flicker of flame reflected in one of the small windows of the inn, called, "Oh, see, they got a fire." The car was parked, and they all trooped into the inn, and at once Higby briskly went over and started the large, noisy, clattery, tinny Nickelodeon with a nickel. And to rival him, and for a prank, Helland ran to the Victrola which stood in one corner and put on a record of the Grizzly Bear, which he found lying there. At the first sounds of this strain, which they all knew, Tina Kogel called, "Oh, let's all dance to that, will you? Can't you stop that other old thing?" She added. "Sure, after it runs down," explained Ratterer, laughingly. "The only way to stop that thing is not to feed it any nickels." But now a waiter coming in, Higby began to inquire what everybody wanted. And in the meantime, to show off her charms, Hortense had taken the center of the floor and was attempting to imitate a grizzly bear walking on its hind legs, which she could do amusingly enough, quite gracefully. And Sparser, seeing her alone in the center of the floor, was anxious to interest her now, followed her and tried to imitate her motions from behind. Finding him clever at it, and anxious to dance, she finally abandoned the imitation and giving him her arms went one-stepping about the room most vividly. At once, Clyde, who was by no means as good a dancer, became jealous, painfully so. In his eagerness for her, it seemed unfair to him that he should be deserted by her so early, at the very beginning of things. But she, becoming interested in Sparser, who seemed more worldly wise, paid no attention at all to Clyde for the time being, but went dancing with her new conquest, his rhythmic skill seeming charmingly to match her own. And then, not to be out of it, the others at once chose partners, Helland dancing with Maida, Ratterer with Lucille and Higby with Tina Kogel. This left Laura Sipe for Clyde, who did not like her very much. She was not as perfect as she might be, a plump, pudgy-faced girl with inadequate sensual blue eyes, and Clyde, lacking any exceptional skill. They danced nothing but the conventional one-step while the others were dipping and lurching and spinning. In a kind of sick fury, Clyde noticed that Sparser, who was still with Hortense, was by now holding her close and looking straight into her eyes, and she was permitting him. It gave him a feeling of lead at the pit of his stomach. Was it possible she was beginning to like this young upstart who had this car? And she had promised to like him for the present. It brought to him a sense of her fickleness, the probability of her real indifference to him. He wanted to do something, stop dancing and get her away from Sparser, but there was no use until this particular record ran out. And then, just at the end of this, the waiter returned with a tray and put down cocktails, ginger ale and sandwiches upon 3 small tables which had been joined together. All but Sparser and Hortense quit and came toward it, a fact which Clyde was quick to note. She was a heartless flirt. She really did not care for him after all. And after making him think that she did, so recently, and getting him to help her with that coat. She could go to the devil now. He would show her. And he waiting for her. Wasn't that the limit? Yet, finally seeing that the others were gathering about the tables, which had been placed near the fire, Hortense and Sparser ceased dancing and approached. Clyde was white and glum. He stood to one side, seemingly indifferent. And Laura Sipe, who had already noted his rage and understood the reason, now moved away from him to join Tina Kogel, to whom she explained why he was so angry. And then, noting his glumness, Hortense came over, executing a phase of the grizzly as she did so. "Gee, wasn't that swell?" she began. "Gee, how I do love to dance to music like that." "Sure, it's swell for you," returned Clyde, burning with envy and disappointment. "Why, what's the trouble?" she asked, in a low and almost injured tone, pretending not to guess, yet knowing quite well why he was angry. "You don't mean to say that you're mad because I danced with him first, do you? Oh, how silly. Why didn't you come over then and dance with me? I couldn't refuse to dance with him when he was right there, could I?" "Oh, no, of course, you couldn't," replied Clyde sarcastically, and in a low, tense tone, for he, no more than Hortense, wanted the others to hear. "But you didn't have to fall all over him and dream in his eyes, either, did you?" He was fairly blazing. "You needn't say you didn't, because I saw you." At this she glanced at him oddly, realizing not only the sharpness of his mood, but that this was the first time he had shown so much daring in connection with her. It must be that he was getting to feel too sure of her. She was showing him too much attention. At the same time she realized that this was not the time to show him that she did not care for him as much as she would like to have him believe, since she wanted the coat, already agreed upon. "Oh, gee, well, ain't that the limit?" she replied angrily, yet more because she was irritated by the fact that what he said was true than anything else. "If you aren't the grouch. Well, I can't help it, if you're going to be as jealous as that. I didn't do anything but dance with him just a little. I didn't think you'd be mad." She moved as if to turn away, but realizing that there was an understanding between them, and that he must be placated if things were to go on, she drew him by his coat lapels out of the range of the hearing of the others, who were already looking and listening, and began. "Now, see here, you. Don't go acting like this. I didn't mean anything by what I did. Honest, I didn't. Anyhow, everybody dances like that now. And nobody means anything by it. Aren't you going to let me be nice to you like I said, or are you?" And now she looked him coaxingly and winsomely and calculatingly straight in the eye, as though he were the one person among all these present whom she really did like. And deliberately, and of a purpose, she made a pursy, sensuous mouth, the kind she could make, and practiced a play of the lips that caused them to seem to want to kiss him, a mouth that tempted him to distraction. "All right," he said, looking at her weakly and yieldingly. "I suppose I am a fool, but I saw what you did, all right. You know I'm crazy about you, Hortense, just wild. I can't help it. I wish I could sometimes. I wish I wouldn't be such a fool." And he looked at her and was sad. And she, realizing her power over him and how easy it was to bring him around, replied, "Oh, you don't, either. I'll kiss you after a while, when the others aren't looking, if you'll be good." At the same time she was conscious of the fact that Sparser's eyes were upon her. Also that he was intensely drawn to her and that she liked him more than anyone she had recently encountered.